Hi everyone. Welcome to Get Whacky. We'll be talking about experimental nonfiction, what's nonfiction, what's experimental, what's writing. I don't know at this stage. Maybe we can start off by doing like a little introduction of ourselves. I can start, and then I'll just throw it to someone else. So I'm Panda. I'm going to be loosely chairing this. I'm a poet and I am broadcasting from Wurundjeri country. And I just want to acknowledge, that I write and I live and I work on like these lands and they're unceded, and there's all these rich storytelling cultures that we have so much to thank for. So I just wanted to quickly say that. Do you want to introduce yourself, Charlotte?
Sure. I'm also on Wurundjeri land. Do I need to do a visual description of myself? Is that what's going on here?
Oh, sorry, I totally thought that.
I'm white and dark hair, pale skin, and I'm wearing a turtleneck. That'll do, right? So I'm a writer, poet, and singer living on Wurundjeri land. My practice is somewhere between poetry and nonfiction, and I feel like I got a lot to say about that, but yeah, we'll leave that for later.
Cool.
Yeah, sorry.
Do you want to go next, Michael?
Yeah, sure. I'm Michael. I'm broadcasting from Gadigal country right now, and I am an Asian Australian man with an overgrown mullet and a white shirt. So I feel like my practice, I work mostly in criticism and like nonfiction writing with a little bit of design as well. So I'm kind of excited to chat about, like the more graphical forms of experimental nonfiction / we'll talk about this as well, like what experimental nonfiction even refers to and like what that means, and like what kind of things in our lives can or cannot be counted as experimental nonfiction, which I'm very excited to have a chat to all of you about.
Cool. Sian, do you want to go next?
Yeah, hi, I'm Sian. I'm living in Nam on the lands of the Wurundjeri people as well, in the Kulin Nation. And I have brown hair that's a bit too short because my housemate and I decided to cut each other's hair the other night. I've got glasses, a greenish shirt, and a denim jacket on.
Awesome, thank you. I'll quickly do my visual description because I totally forgot. I'm an Asian woman. I have a fringe that is also too short because I went a bit girl interrupted after therapy one day. And I am wearing green eyeshadow / eyeliner and brown lipstick. So I guess what I wanted to start off with was maybe if we could go into how our own practices sit in relation to experimental nonfiction. Love to hear about all of your practices.
I'm currently studying a PhD, and my kind of topic is looking at the kind of divide between fiction and nonfiction, how that kind of space operates and the potentiality of that space, I guess. So my kind of topic is whether or not kind of hiding nonfiction sort of with the veil of fiction, if it makes it easier to kind of tell your own stories. If you can kind of just sort of say, haha, it's not true, wink, wink, if that makes it easier to tell the truth. That's kind of what I'm working on at the moment. What I find really interesting about this, I guess, we can sort of get to whether or not we consider it, a genre, a practice, what we want to call it. But yeah, that's kind of what I'm interested in and what I'm doing.
Sorry, this is like totally not the point, but Sian, do you have like an example of like what your favorite like example of that kind of writing is? Like, would you call it autofiction? I don't know.
Yeah, autofiction is my kind of genre of interest. Metafiction also has a lot of overlap with that. That kind of directing to the camera or the reader in the case of literature. Kind of forms of fiction. There's so many different words for it and terms for it that are all kind of different but very similar. Faction is another one. Part of what I'm also trying to do with my study is map out all these different terms and figure out how they kind of relate to each other or don't relate. But yeah, autofiction is probably what I'm most closely looking at. And I guess examples of that, I mean, the one kind of everyone kind of goes to is I Love Dick by Chris Kraus. But my favorite is Black Wave by Michelle T, which is about an apocalypse, but it's very much, to me, a memoir.
Cool. Thanks for expanding on that. Michael, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Like, I feel like, I don't know, like it's weird thinking about how my practice sits within experimental nonfiction, because I feel like there are definitely things that I've created in the past where I can quite clearly be like, this is experimental, either because it's like multimedia, or, you know, like it has elements that are pushing the boundary of like what writing actually is, or like what that actually means, especially if I'm using like graphic design or like other video elements in like a more traditional nonfiction essay, for example. But then I'm kind of also curious as to, like, I guess almost similar to what Sian said, this idea of like experimental in the sense of mixing genres together and creating unexpected genre hybrids. I feel like I've definitely created work in the past that kind of blends the modes of memoir and criticism. But then now looking back at that, I actually kind of do question myself, and I'm like, is that actually experimental, or is that just like quite a common way of writing criticism? You know what I mean? So I feel like that's something that would be really interesting for us to talk about as well, is like what kind of genre hybrids actually count as experimental / are we just placing, you know, like too melodramatic a term on something that's actually quite commonplace?
I'm often asking myself, is this experimental enough to be called experimental? Well, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good thing to think about. Something I think about as well is that something that's experimental at one time might not be experimental at another time. It's just time and context, maybe. Charlotte, did you want to tell us a bit about your practice, like poetry, experimental nonfiction?
I would say I write more poetry than nonfiction, but when I do go there, it's usually if I'm exploring a memory, because I'm not really sure where memory sits in the fiction nonfiction scale, and I wouldn't like, I never sit down and go like, I'm going to write a creative nonfiction piece now. It's just something that gets tacked on at the end, because for lack of a better umbrella term. And there's so many little subgenres as well. Like, you know, I think like someone told me about auto theory today as well. Like it's a hybrid in itself, combining elements of like autobiography and theory. So I don't know. Yeah, I tend to just start writing, see where it goes. And then by the end, I'm like, oh, okay, well, this is probably, I wouldn't just call it nonfiction because it's not all completely factual. But maybe the truthful part of it is just the emotion at the center of it. And yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with that.
I kind of love that idea that you mentioned of like where we can sort of put memory in this kind of fact versus fiction box. I think that's the same with so many things that we think of as nonfiction, like history. I mean, it's all kind of up for debate about whether or not it's like quote unquote true. So how do we sort of, I don't know, play with that? I think that's what's interesting.
Remember, there was an essay I read about that recently, about how like history can't really be written completely true in a true way. But anyway, I can't remember who the writer was.
Yeah, I mean, it's also subjective. And I think that that's what interests me about this genre, is that the potentiality and kind of like the honesty of just saying, you know, nothing's real. It's all just subjective, I guess.
Yeah. No, I love that point you made about history, because I did this panel yesterday on anti-colonial Asian histories. And when I was looking up the histories for Sarawak, which is where I'm from, I realized that so much of it was just propaganda for this white dude, James Brooke. And then when I was like, I'm reading between the lines, and he's just like an Orientalist who wanted to reenact his fantasies, but he just portrayed himself as this guy who like saved Sarawak from pirates. Anyways, I'm not going to go too into that because I'm too obsessed with it.
On the history, I was talking to a friend today about what's going to constitute nonfiction, and she brought up Hamilton the musical.
Oh my God,
I was like, it kind of is experimental nonfiction because
we're not classifying Hamilton as experimental nonfiction.
Well, was Hamilton rapping his way through the revolution for real? Like, experimental. Anyway.
I love that idea. Let's make some wild claims here, and let's just throw out that Lin-Manuel Miranda is an experimental nonfiction writer, and let's just get some people real heated.
Yeah.
It's such a true thing, though, that history is like just what we think of as history is really just like the people that, you know, won whatever war get to tell the story about it. It's like, well, that is the essence of it, that it's just a story.
Yeah. No, I think that's so true. I was also going to ask Charlotte, kind of in relation to your practice, do you feel like the poetry and nonfiction overlaps? Like, do you interweave the two together?
Yeah. But then if you put the two together in the same piece, what would you call that piece? You know, I guess it could be both. Yeah.
Well, I'm like, my practice is, I'm a poet. And actually, when I got the email for this, I was like, I just want to double check that you know that I'm a poet. And they were like, yeah, we know. And I was like, actually started thinking about it. And I think that, I guess poetry for me is like maybe innately a little bit experimental nonfiction, at least in the way that it presents in my practice. I guess it's, you know, my poems explore my insular landscape, and I guess the way that I view the world is that the world is like fucking amazing and also fucking wild. Like, I was talking to a friend, I was like, I can't believe that in the last fortnight we had an earthquake. Grimes was photographed reading like Marx, just like all this banana stuff that sounds like fiction, but I'm like, it's real life. And I guess that the ways in which maybe the experimentation manifests is, I guess with my poems, like I've made a game, I've collaborated with musicians, I've done like interactive poems, a lot of digital work, but I think that maybe it's not necessarily, I guess the result might be experimental, but the impetus is maybe that I just get really bored and like need to try lots of different things. Yeah. So yeah, that's my practice, just bored poet, I guess. I guess that a thing that has kind of cropped up just in this like little intro of our practices, thanks for sharing everyone, is I guess what do you all think experimental nonfiction is? And I guess what do you think maybe are the limits of that term? Like, I think that would be good to go into.
I mean, personally, I think Hamilton is outside our limit, whatever limit it is. But I do think it's like, it's a really hard limit to define. Because especially like, I think something that you said, Panda, that resonated as well, was that you said like the limits are constantly shifting, and it's like what is experimental today may not even be experimental in like 6 months' time, for example, especially because I think there are so many trends in writing. I think like one particular one that I like have noticed is talking specifically about like this genre of like the nonfiction lyrical essay. I feel like something to me, and this is not even like a drag of anyone, I feel like it's not even a hot take, it's just, I feel like it's no longer experimental to even have like a genre mashup or like have like different forms in a lyrical essay, because I think I'm seeing so many like amazing emerging work that is ostensibly in the format of an essay, but then includes like bits of poetry and like, you know, like screenshots and like diary entries and like multimedia work, like music. It's like I feel like that's something that it's honestly becoming its own genre. And then I'm like, can we even call that experimental anymore? Or is it so now well defined and like well parametered that it's no longer experimental? So I don't know, like I think it's a really hard thing to define. And I don't think I really have an answer for it, which is an incredibly fence-sitting answer.
I feel like when we think about what is experimental, we're thinking of things that are playing with existing forms and functions and ways of doing things. And I think that one of the hardest things is nothing feels new. Like nothing's ever really new. I don't know. Maybe that's I feel like a lot of what we see sort of classified as experimental has actually been done before, like for, I don't know, like decades. But I think what's new is maybe how we think of it, how the kind of value we place on it. I don't know. I have no idea either.
Yeah, they come up in the last couple of decades or something, but I'm sure that kind of writing did exist.
Well, I mean, like something I think about a lot is because obviously I'm concerned with trying to define kind of what autofiction is and isn't as part of what I'm doing. If you think about it, and again, like I don't want to get too wild here, but if you think about it, like if autofiction is, a version of, you take yourself, you make yourself a character and you put yourself into sort of fictional scenarios, while maintaining this kind of essence of truth and selfhood. Like Seinfeld, the show, is autofiction, because it's about Jerry Seinfeld, who is a comedian. He's a comedian in the show. He's like putting himself in this fictional landscape, but also it's himself as a character. Like that's autofiction. Yeah. So I don't know. I think it's all kind of interesting to think about. And I know at least with my own research, I find myself just going around and around in circles. And like once you start thinking like, what is experimental nonfiction? Like what is autofiction or whatever? You just find examples of it kind of everywhere.
Yeah, and I think that's nice that we're kind of finding it hard to grasp, because I think our relationship with truth, which is, nonfiction to an extent, is really slippery. And I think we have maybe now we understand that there's heaps of truths depending on like your positioning. And I think experimental nonfiction kind of reflects that shift in how we experience truth and the world. I also think that I guess the thing that I was thinking about with experimental nonfiction was I was like, there's so many more ways in which we engage with the world. So it makes sense that the ways we represent it have also become so broad. Like I was talking to someone and I was like, we actually write so much in a day. Like we text, we send emails. We're like kind of writing in an almost, I think maybe at an unprecedented pace. Like I guess, I don't know, compared to 200 years ago where you had to find a quill and make some ink and some paper. Writing is so accessible to us, so we do it all the time. So I feel like, I think for me, experimental nonfiction is stuff that also kind of explores all the different ways in which we experience the world and truth. But I also find it really hard to say when something isn't nonfiction, like I was, experimental nonfiction, like I was kind of thinking in the shower as you do about how I was like, is Azalea Banks's like Instagram stories, is that experimental nonfiction? I think it is. And also I'm like, if someone tells you that it isn't, I mean, that's just your truth. So
yeah, maybe Hamilton is my truth. You know what I'm saying?
This is on that note, like who gets to decide? You know what I mean? Like if you're reading, say, a work of experimental nonfiction that's very heavily based around a person's own experiences, if you're reading that text and you have absolutely no idea who the author is, you're going to have a completely different sort of interpretation of that text and what it means than someone who knows every intimate detail of this author's life. I mean, when I think about all the times when I've read an autofiction work and I've known, for instance, that the author's partner's name is X, or that they used to do this for a living, kind of those biographical details that you can find in kind of maybe their Wikipedia or in interviews, or maybe you just know the author. It's completely different if you don't know those things. I mean, I don't know. I just kind of think that, so you kind of, it's almost like this, I don't know how how to say it, but yeah, you kind of just need to, it's this grain of salt kind of situation where you could say something is or isn't true or untrue, and like kind of what does that mean and who gets to decide that.
Going back to something that you said, Panda, I absolutely agree that Zelia Banks' stories are experimental nonfiction. I actually think I'm like now that we're thinking about it more, I'm like, are all Instagram stories experimental nonfiction? Because genuinely, I'm like, okay, like now that I'm like galaxy braining about this, I feel like if we think about Carolyn Calloway, for example, like 5 years ago, I would actually say that she was like an innovator in experimental nonfiction. Because do you remember when she like first started using Instagram, and then it was that whole thing where it was like she claimed to be the first person to have like long form Instagram stories, where she would like write out like 2,000 word long essays on Instagram stories, like detailing her entire life. And I'm like, that was experimental nonfiction. Like, but then it also leads into this, like, I absolutely agree with like the whole galaxy brain thing of like, is everything we write experimental nonfiction?
Is it experimental because of the platform it was put on?
But then, and also then if people are still doing it, is it still experimental? You know what I mean? Like if it's just become the mode through which we tell stories about ourselves, are we still experimenting, or are we just participating in kind of mainstream ways of storytelling now? Like that's what's so interesting, is like it's we could say that the genre itself of Instagram stories is experimental nonfiction. But the experimental part for me would be the people who did it first, who really played with this idea, who were like, let's put this out into the world, and let's play with the form and structure. And now if we're all doing it, it's kind of like, is that experimentation? I don't know. I mean, maybe. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just posing the question.
I think it is if you consider like experimentation as interchangeable with like originality, or like, I mean, I think it's possible to just keep experimenting into oblivion, though. I kind of think the opposite can be true, you know, because every piece of writing is going to be a different deviation or a different hybrid. I don't know, but like you can apply that to any text. So.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I also think that experimental functions on like 2 levels for me. Like there's the experimental where you're comparing it against like the whole canon of work that exists, but then there's also experimental within the context of your own practice and how you're playing with the forms that you're used to. And I think it's nice to kind of have that micro level almost, and for viewing your practice as experimental nonfiction. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting like thing to think about, that I keep going in loops about what things are nonfiction. But I also wanted to say that I think Caroline Calloway walks the line between experimental nonfiction and performance artist. And I think I think there's probably a lot of other practices out there that exist like that, but none as iconic and horrifying, maybe. I was also just going to ask, I guess while we're on this tangent, I guess sometimes it feels like maybe there can be rules within experimental nonfiction. I guess we're kind of talking about some of the restrictions now. Do you think that kind of negates the nature of experimentation, those innate rules? Or, yeah, so I just wanted to know your thoughts on that.
I actually think it sort of does. Where like I feel like if a particular form of writing or like work, like if a particular form or genre of work has reached a point where there are actually rules around it, I actually think that would put it in conflict with the status of being experimental. Because it feels to me, it's like, that's like the experiment has now ended. It's like you've experimented and then now you've come away with like a tangible result, where it's like, this is a new genre that we've actually created, or this is a new form that we've actually created. Like, I think that's, like going back to the point of autofiction again, I'm like, is autofiction itself innately still experimental, or is it now just like a properly defined genre? I'm sure, Sian, you have more insights into that than I do.
No, well, I think what you were just saying about the idea of, you know, we experiment and then we find a result. I mean, that's the key part to me of experimentation, is that you experiment because you have kind of a question in mind and you you're playing around with things to try and get to an answer. However, you know, you find that answer, or whether maybe just experimenting itself is the point. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of putting it. I kind of feel like experimental nonfiction has almost become an umbrella term for all these different little subgenres that are all kind of playing sort of with different things in order to get at maybe kind of a similar answer. I don't know. I think, yeah, it's a hard one. I don't know. I have no answers.
I'm interested in knowing whether each of you actually find having a set of rules in that genre helpful, or if it's more, you know, for me, for example, I prefer to actually not think about it, you know, until it's done.
I guess it's that question of who do genres serve? Who is it useful to say whether something is, you know, X or Y? I think it serves readers, and I don't know that it necessarily serves writers.
Oh, interesting. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well,
really,
if you know what you like to read and you're going looking for a certain genre, like having a genre to go, you know, digging around in, that's useful to you as a reader. But as a writer, I agree with Charlotte. I think it kind of it doesn't really serve you as an artist to kind of set out knowing what you're going to create before you've even created it.
That's interesting. I think, I mean, a way I was thinking about it as well, which might be, I guess sometimes, this is so tricky. I was gonna be like, you know, that whole thing when people are like, Picasso was like, you have to know the rules to break them. And that's not necessarily my practice at all. But I think sometimes, I guess I'm thinking about forms of poetry, for example, where there's quite a few poets who do this. They take like official documents and work into them. And I think that like knowledge of that form is what allows them to rupture it and break it and shift it. But yeah, I don't think rules should be a limit, but I think the knowledge of them is interesting for writers to play with and to kind of work against, because, you know, rules can also represent a lot of other things like authority and white supremacy and stuff. But yeah, that was just a fleeting thought I wanted to put out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think Rachel Cusk is a great example of experimental writing. And I think her latest few books, people have sort of said, you know, they're revolutionizing the novel, like they're, you know, doing all this kind of interesting experimental things. But they're just her latest books in a series of a long career. She's written lots of novels that did follow those rules beforehand. So maybe that's what she needed to do to get to a place where she could then kind of say, you know, fuck the novel or something, you know what I mean? Like you have to write a novel to throw it in the trash. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I love it. I'm like, throw it in the trash. I was also kind of wondering, I think maybe this kind of actually draws back to a bit earlier in terms of our practices, but how do you get ideas for your experimental nonfiction, or like, I guess, what inspires you in short? Are there any kind of like works you look to, or practitioners?
I mean, like, not to expose myself, and I definitely will not be naming any names, but I feel like I definitely do have this like very large bookmarks folder that I just like return to of like saved work from other writers who I really admire, like locally and internationally. That I feel like it's almost become like a ritual where like before I write anything, I have to read like this list of works to like, get myself like in the mood to actually be creative and write. But I feel like it's like I think that's why I kind of brush up against the idea of like writers coming from a place where there are no rules. Like I actually find myself working a lot better when I know that there are like existing works, like existing forms that I can take inspiration from their form or like the tone, but then create like entirely new work within that. And I think for me personally, I think it's much easier for me to get inspired if I'm like getting creative within a certain set of boundaries, as opposed to being like let loose into the world. And then I'm like, oh, like I don't like, it's a void. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. What does everyone else think?
I think sometimes just read, I do the same thing. Like if you read before you write, you end up not soaking up the exact tone of that writer, but you're soaking up, I guess, like the boundaries or the stylistic choices that they've made, and you can sort of run with that. Even like maybe it'll be unconscious if you've just put the book down, you know.
Yeah, I sort of feel similarly, but I sort of really try to distance myself from that as much as possible. I'll definitely read a work where I'm like, oh my God, I'm so inspired. I wish I could have written this book. And then you have to, as a, I guess, writer and artist, take a step back and say, well, I don't wish that I'd written this book because this book already exists. And I'm not going to go away and try and write this book because it exists already. So I'm going to try and write my own thing because that's of value to the world rather than just trying to be the next X, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I totally get what you mean. I was also just thinking about as well, I guess, having those other works to refer to. And I guess I kind of, in my head, I was linking it a bit to like how in the past when art movements happened, they happened in groups of people. And I guess that's how those works function for me. Not necessarily that I know any of the people I deeply admire and like refer to in my work, but it feels like, I guess, an ideological, like collective thing to be able to access those works and interact with them. I don't know if that's a bit tangential. That was also just a fleeting thought.
No, I think that's really interesting. And I think it's also interesting to think about the fact that when we do look at those groups of people that have kind of formed, you know, movements or whatever before, historically they've usually been like friends or run within the same social circles. And I think that we're now in the last kind of few decades or even more recently getting to a point where that's no longer necessarily the case. Like the people who are creating these kind of movements don't necessarily know each other or even read each other's work. I mean, I assume for the most part they do, and they've certainly heard of each other. But I think it's probably, I mean, I get, this is so tangential. I'm just thinking that that's really interesting. You got me thinking about this, Panda, about how probably this is the first time in history where, you know, like the Beats were all hanging out and having sex with each other. And, you know, that's not necessarily the case when we think of all the big names of like autofiction, for example. And yeah, that's really interesting, like how maybe the internet kind of changes the way we interact with our peers when it comes to things like experimental modes.
Yeah, and also I'm like, I guess that when, I don't know, for example, if you Google experimental nonfiction, not actually that much comes up, which is interesting.
It keeps getting called creative nonfiction.
Nonfiction is creative because you have to make it.
It all just goes around and around in circles, and there's nothing. And I don't know. Yeah, it's a mess. This is the problem. I've been doing my PhD. I could just rant about this for 3 hours about the fact that it is all a hot mess. I mean, I wrote over summer last Christmas. I wrote a research essay that was positing whether or not self-insert fan fiction could be considered autofiction. Yes. Because like you could say that it is. I don't know. Should you say it? I don't know. But you can if you want to. You could say it.
I'm like, it's their truth. And I want to see more of it out in the world.
Has anyone, I haven't read it, but has anyone read Rodham? So it's like fan fiction by, gosh, who's the author again? I can't remember her name.
Oh, right. Like is it the Hillary Clinton one?
Yeah. It's basically fan fiction about Hillary Clinton that is an experimental novel. And I'm like, we're allowed to do this, I guess. Like,
oh my gosh, we are. It actually reminds me of this fan fiction that I read where Gerard Way falls in love with a fly. And it kind of makes me think, when you kind of look at the news and stuff, which is, you know, nonfiction, so many articles are like, seem like someone just wrote them, or like The Onion, or I don't know, whatever, like, anyways, I just think that's an interesting thing you touch upon, whether maybe self-insert fan fiction can be experimental nonfiction, because I feel like it can. And I wonder if anyone disagrees with that.
I do like I just find it interesting, this idea of where do we actually I feel like we have to draw the point somewhere and just be like, that's not nonfiction, that's just fiction, right? Like I feel like, for example, something like Rodin by Curtis Sinfeld, as you were saying, to me that feels like just straight up fiction. Like that's like, to me that's like an alternative history, which I don't know whether we would class as experimental nonfiction, because it's like that's just like you're imagining something it's based on a historical event, but it's like a completely new imagined story. I'm not too sure whether that.
Back on the Seinfeld example as well, I think it's more like a fictionalized version of himself in a fictional world. So I mean, maybe I wouldn't class it as nonfiction, even though it's the same guy, you know?
Yeah, but then also within Seinfeld, you're watching his stand-up routines. So there's this element of
true.
Unsettled.
But maybe it's a fiction work with elements of nonfiction.
I mean, I agree with both of you. I agree that Rodham is probably just an alternate history, and we should deeply classify it as fiction. And I agree that Seinfeld is not a show about real life. But I think it's really interesting to think about the way that these genres kind of play with that divide, and kind of what the purpose of playing with that divide is. Like, what's the purpose of Seinfeld making a show about himself? You know, like what was the and you see it with all the comedians, right? You had Ellen had a show about herself called Ellen. Everybody Loves Raymond, Ray Romano. It's a rich kind of genre of sitcom, is the comedian who has a sitcom starring themselves for some reason. It's like, why? What's the point? But again,
title including their name, which is a bold move. Like, imagine if I just wrote a book called Panda. Anyways,
and I would read it.
Maybe you should.
I was also just thinking, I guess, when we're making this work, I guess it'd be interesting to know who you think your audiences are, or who you're making the work for.
I try not to think about it personally.
Interesting. I think I'm the same way, but I think it's more in the sense that I saw this meme which was like, poets just write poetry for attention or something like that. And I was like, true. And I was like, I don't care where the attention comes from. And that's my audience, basically. Like, anyone is fine with me. And I always end up being kind of surprised by who reads it.
I would agree with that. I think if you're an artist of any kind, you do kind of have this reliance in some way of that art being consumed. I would sort of say that I would want my writing to be consumed, but I also wouldn't want to write to any specific audience, because I feel like maybe that would change what I was trying to do, or change what I was trying to say, or even just psych me out of doing it in the first place, potentially.
I feel like as soon as I try and make an assumption about who might find it interesting, I start limiting myself, and I start it becomes less imaginative. And I feel like the audience is whoever responds to it. And people are always going to see themselves in your art, and across demographics, you know what I mean? It's kind of remarkable how that happens.
I feel like I have like a slightly different answer. Maybe this is just like my toxic trait talking. Because like I predominantly write criticism, I often, unfortunately, view my audience as like other writers. But it kind of like harks back to, I remember like on Twitter recently, there was this like big debate, and then like unfortunately this like quasi cancellation. But anyway, it was like a poetry editor at like a large American lit journal had tweeted being like, you know, like no one is actually going to take poetry seriously. We write poetry for other poets, and the sooner we realize that, the sooner we can actually like stop caring about the audience itself. And I think that's actually like, despite obviously the level of noise on Twitter that created, I think there is actually an interesting discourse to be had there. where it's like, who are like, are we just writing for other writers? Because I think oftentimes, unfortunately, that is, I think, who I'm writing for. And I think the benefit of that is that it feels like you're not thinking about like how to commercialize your work. It's like this is writing for people who get it. As a famous meme icon said, if you get it, you get it. If you don't, you don't. But I also do understand that there is this whole other world out there where it's like you obviously there are people who are just, you know, like regular people, by which I mean non-writers and not in the industry, sane people who are probably like reading your work as well. So I find it quite a dilemma when I'm creating work.
Yeah. This is a bit of a tangent, but I was like, do you have an example of like a really surprising type of, like a surprising person who's read your work, that's made you be like, oh, okay, maybe this is my audience, but just this one person of that demographic?
I think sometimes it's like people who I went to high school with, who like pop up being like, oh, like I read this and I really loved it, and I was like, whoa, like we literally didn't talk at all in high school. You hated me. Like, what is this? But obviously, it still is much appreciated. And I I think it's honestly just like, I think for me it's more like random people from random corners of my life as opposed to people who I didn't already know. Because I think I don't have preconceptions about people in the general public, whereas obviously I do have preconceptions about people in my life.
Yeah.
I guess that kind of raises kind of the point that the Australian writing scene is quite small.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very kind of different and insular kind of space compared to, you know, maybe like the US writing scene. So realistically, if you're published in a small journal here, the people who are buying that journal are going to be other writers primarily, or the relatives or close friends of other writers. So it does create this kind of insular demographic, I suppose, in a way that you don't maybe necessarily always see in other countries.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's actually a really good point. I think also I just kind of want to touch on, I guess maybe the idea of experimental nonfiction, just maybe with like lots of other things that have that prefix experimental, like experimental film, experimental art. Usually it's not seen as for everyone. It's usually seen for quite a niche subset of people. Do you think that's the case with experimental nonfiction? Like, is experimental nonfiction for everyone, or can it be for everyone? Or, yeah, I'm just intrigued by that.
I mean, I guess the short answer for me would be, yeah, it's for everybody, in the way that kind of anything is for everybody, I suppose. I mean, there's no, you know, bouncer at the door of experimental nonfiction. I mean, I don't know if we think that maybe there should be, but I guess, yeah, that's kind of how I think about it. I don't know if others disagree.
I agree with you, like that the answer is broadly yes, and that it can definitely be for everyone. But I think the flip side of that is that just because it can be for everyone doesn't mean you should feel pressure to have to appeal to everyone. And I think that's often a trap that we can fall in as writers, I feel, is like, how can I make my work necessarily like broader when sometimes like that's not really true to what you want to write. So I guess, yeah, it's like everyone can and should be accessing it. But doesn't mean that we have to necessarily, that shouldn't be like at the forefront of our minds, in my personal opinion.
Yeah.
I have no idea what the answer to that is, but I feel like I can only speak to my own writing. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know, when I get more specific about a personal experience, for example, that seems to be when more people actually can relate to it, weirdly, like the more specific you get. Whereas if you're more diffuse, it's like you've got nothing to hold on to, and people don't get what you're saying. So I don't know, but I'm not trying to write to like to assume what anybody is experiencing.
I don't think we have much time left, so I'm going to have to start wrapping up. But I was just going to say that I think one of the funny, kind of cute things that has come out of this is that we've said a lot of times, I don't think I have the exact answer for this, or I don't have an answer for that. And I think that just kind of speaks to like the nature of experimental nonfiction and how like nebulous it is. So yeah, I'm just going to wrap up. But was there anything anyone else wanted to say before they go? Any final favorite experimental nonfictions along the line of, God forbid, Hamilton, before we leave?
I guess we should all just go away and write some self-insert fanfic about Hamilton.
Yeah, we should start our own movement of experimental nonfiction, as there are none. All right.
Yet. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, everyone. It was really nice to chat and have kind of all these surprising examples of experimental nonfiction come up. And thanks to NYWF for hosting this. And thanks for everyone for watching it. But yeah,
thanks for moderating, Heather.
Oh, thanks. I feel like it was a bit chaotic, but as I said pre the recording, I woke up from a nap 2 hours ago, and maybe that's part of my experimental nonfiction practice. But yeah,
you do a great job.
Nothing is praxis.
All right, thanks everyone. I guess see you on the other side.
See you.